Hi, I'm Matthew Wilson and I'm the selected artist for this year's Renew Walls project with Artspace Gallery Lisburn. Today I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to myself, my practice, alongside chatting through some recent examples of my work and talking a bit about the project itself. So to begin, for those who don't know, Renew Walls is a now annual project run by Artspace Gallery and connecting their relationship to the Wallace collection in London. It draws on Sir Richard Wallace's vast connection to the people and place of Lisburn. With a complicated life, he became owner of the Hertford estate, which spans the now modern communities of Lisburn, Moira, Glenaby, to name a few. And this extensive land ownership gave Wallace great political power as MP for the area at the time. However, he was and continues to be known as a main benefactor for the area, funding large projects such as the now Wallace High School and the local assembly rooms. But beyond these shores, he was also widely celebrated as a philanthropist, and his wife, Lady Wallace, gifted the nation the Wallace collection upon her death. So with the project, artists are encouraged to work with the collection, and although operating slightly differently for 2021, I will still be taking inspiration from the collection, and especially inspired by the Rococo period, seen so lavishly kind of within the collection's interiors. And this project will be viewable from the windows of Artspace and will be developing over the duration of the run, so make sure to pop by if possible. So I myself am a visual artist. I'm also a recent graduate in 2021, and emerging into post-art school life amidst the pandemic has definitely been challenging, but opportunities like this one have been really incredible and a great opportunity to utilise kind of the experience during this time especially. So I currently split my time between my studio here in the country and my studio in the city, which I'm lucky enough to have as artist in residence at the Belfast School of Art. And I think maybe an apt place to begin to talk about my work would be to quote the words of Jean Emery, to say, "Nothing is resolved, nothing is finished, memory remains unfinished business." And I think this perpetual state of breaking down and building up really sets the premise for a lot of my work, reminiscent of thresholds between public and private, past and present, and more expansively life and death. My work is fueled by curiosity. Making for me has always felt necessary in that sense, and to ask questions both of myself and of kind of the wider world as well. And I think we're all making and living as a result of the experiences we have, either consciously or unconsciously. Kind of culture permeates all our lives, and for me I think that's a really nice link between my own work and both the work of Artspace and this project itself, is the idea of legacy and heritage, considering what has been left behind, but also the ability to open up this dialogue between people and place, and perhaps most consequentially how to take that into the future. And although kind of bringing these experiences maybe from a personal or kind of in the case of the project a research base, it's how we can open up the work, become porous enough to allow others to kind of find themselves in this universal and collective. And often this is dealt with for me in a didactic way, with the material and form always conveying meaning. Material for me is always really significant in the process. I'm drawn to materials which maybe aren't as traditional and definitely aren't conventionally easy to work with. And although I'm working mainly in sculptural installation, my practice kind of fluctuates between many different spheres to answer really the demands of the work as it's required. And I guess an example of this kind of variety of materials would be within the past 6 months or so I've used, paper, stone, plaster, metal, wood, fabric, and kind of these materials are only sitting alongside other aspects of my practice, such as drawing and photography, which continue to run as kind of a critical thread that weaves itself through my practice. And although these things run parallel alongside one another, they're not exactly dealing with the same things, and often it's kind of knowing and allowing one and the other to breathe as necessary, to find form, to have my hand in the making. And for me, a lot of the meaning in the work is forged in these processes of making. As we move through as well to see some of the work, the idea of touch being implied but never granted to the viewer is also really important in that sense. And what will also become evident is my use of kind of recovered materials and objects which have become really integral, and that often centres on transformative processes and with artefacts of one lived experience irreversibly becoming changed, denying their functionality, and then becoming charged with that experience of prior existence. And much of this material interest for me harks back to the importance of education in my practice, be that traditional or untraditional. I'm really lucky to have an experience of a variety of educational settings. Here being that university, but also studying abroad, but also within the local community on projects and really just learning experiences. And the foundational skills for me have often been learnt beyond kind of the walls of educational settings as well. And I think when working across a range of media such as I do, there is a reliance on other fields of knowledge outside that maybe traditional artistic context for a dissemination of knowledge. And in a similar vein, that shifting material interest also requires an ability to learn new processes. But for me, there's a real joy in that learning and kind of being in that environment of learning, and wherever that may be. And I think for many artists that definitely comes from a place of problem solving as well. So in many ways the work is similar to a process of excavation, dealing almost with an archaeological or an anthropological approach, chipping away at something to get deeper perhaps. The landscape I grew up in and live in continues to be such a huge influence on my practice, often kind of this idea of being a mediator to the landscape, questioning what it means to pause in this landscape which refuses to be drawn to a halt, relentlessly kind of pushed season to season, generation after generation, and taking the time to question what becomes such a place with each of these passing demises. And my work kind of gently attempts to render that experience and the place into the visual, whilst also navigating that sense of belonging. And really that comes from noticing things, the banality of it all, paying attention to the small, the poetic, the mundane, and seeing everything really as fodder with potential. Camera rolls and notes apps become filled with documentation and ideas which allow things kind of time to simmer and taken in by kind of the seductive material quality of surface or the allure of the found object, and the intimacy of experiences which come with that. And all these things lie in kind of dormant often, and the work requires time in that introspection, both in kind of creation and in contemplation. But for me, everything often finds its place, and eventually, and there is a trust obviously required in that process. So growing up rurally definitely offered a sense of freedom, and there was an access to materials from a young age, which not even in an artistic sense, but just really having access to these materials to play around, to jump off, climb on, build with, kind of built a series of material relationships which I think have become foundational to my practice now. And much of what I've come to learn about art, I think, is actually not from these traditional settings, but from this place, and the idea of kind of always being part of something. And often these material relationships are what I'm playing off in the work, using materials which people do with familiarity with, they can kind of have some cultural resonance with, and kind of anchor that in the domestic and then somehow make it anachronistic, uncomfortable to engage the viewer. For me, a really important idea within that is this idea of staying at the whole place, kind of deeply examining a deep investigation to kind of get at the whole world, as I was talking about earlier. So I'm now going to chat about some more recent pieces and then lead through to the work I've been creating for Arspace. So I'm going to begin with this piece called All the Things We Couldn't Say, which for me was a really important piece. It was a point I think I was getting towards making the work I wanted to create for quite some time. It was exhibited at our gadget show in the MAC, and more recently as well at We're Red in Dublin. And the piece is entirely hollow and constructed solely of wallpaper. For me, there was also a really important process behind the finished work and the relationship I had to that, and physically stripping the wallpaper from a home here in the land, and then that lying dormant for months while that kind of initial aesthetic attraction developed into the form of the work. And there's a trust in not rushing that process, but also choosing to elevate the status of things, these materials which otherwise maybe would have been considered disposable or throwaway, and then my choice to make that visible, but also the challenge that comes with that of it being a finite material, and my action then in that process. And the material itself really shows the skin of experience and that kind of layered history, and develops a lot on ideas I was thinking of at the time, and continue to feed my practice of the home being a strong or a fragile place. And often, in the case of this piece and some of the others I'm going to show, it's working with exact replicas of real and familiar objects which kind of are knotted in that familiar and unfamiliar space, and what we know perhaps and what we don't. So this is another work created last year, entitled, and it's just another example of the work and material coming together in a really embryonic way, having access to the material, which is a damask tablecloth, and then figuring out the form that I wanted that to take, and then working backwards to engineer the piece. And I think that's something really important to me here in the studio, is that element of play. There's lots of material tests and planning which make up to the final work, which then that final process is often maybe quite immersive or often methodical, but I think that light-hearted play at the beginning really allows me then to carry through to the more serious final work. And yeah, using materials like the tablecloth and the bricks that it sit upon, really extracting the ordinary and the mundane to create something which we know but perhaps don't want to know. And then this work is a more recent one, entitled Dream House, and like many of the other works is outwardly quite minimal. Viewers are kind of drawn in by maybe literal or kind of visual cues which open up other lines of association subtly, I think, and places elements of the domestic, the agricultural, and in some other areas of my practice, the religious, and these things often are sitting alongside one another, but also appear in contention with one another. And the materiality of a piece like this obviously reflecting that physical manifestation of a history and transition, dealing with these kind of core imagery or symbols that we can all relate to culturally, and deal with ideas of spaces of sustenance or meeting, communication, play, and just kind of working with those and making them uncomfortable for people in some sense. And this is then the first work I created as part of the Renew Walls project, entitled Empty Plaque to a House's Rise and Fall. The title is actually taken from a line from a Seamus Heaney poem, Ancestral Photograph, which is something that had stayed with me for quite some time, and kind of researching Sir Richard Wallace's life, difficult in many ways for him, and then also his legacy here in Lisburn, the house which he built opposite Castle Gardens, which still stands today, and thinking about all those things kind of in this idea of a memorial or a plaque, almost ghosting a piece which could be in the collection in London. A key feature of the project is the encouragement of artists to work with new materials and innovate their practice in that sense. And for me, I had never worked with casting or plaster, especially on this scale before, so for me it was a real opportunity to expand the work, to kind of investigate the sensitivity I might employ in other areas of my practice within these materials and on this scale. And of course plaster was such a significant material within the Rococo period, with the stucco ceilings and the ornate detailing which we see throughout these homes, which began often by craftspeople taking two-dimensional designs and converting those then by sculpting into the three-dimensional form. And that was really something that came up from my research, was this desire to kind of focus in on these intimate and intricate details, such as the scrolls and these kind of natural forms so evident throughout the Rococo style, and remove some of that kind of overwhelming feeling that you can really get from going into some of these spaces. So the work also kind of, in a sense, is ghosting and kind of, but there's a desire really to keep kind of an active engagement and looking, so from the street maybe catching your eye and then kind of requiring a deeper examination. So really moving on now for the rest of the project, I'm creating some really quite large scale works, again focusing in on these elements of pattern and kind of creating an unfamiliarity almost in through that scale, creating physical presences within the space, but also dealing with the landscape around Lisburn, which I've been lucky enough to be able to shoot some photographs of and spend time in to really inform the process of making. So I'm really excited for the project to come together, people to experience it. So if you're able, please do pop down and have a look through the windows. I'm really excited for that. And if you'd like to find out more about me or my work, you can visit my website, which is www.matthewwilsonartist.com, or my Instagram is @_Matthew Wilson __. Thank you.